Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Friday night comic stream. Since I already did next week's comics, I thought this time we would do something a little different and look at some trade paperbacks that I think every comic fan should read, or at least, in my opinion, should try to read because they're awesome. So, how you guys doing tonight? Everybody doing okay? Having fun? Living the good life? Etc. Whatever it is you people do, with your jobs and your grown-up stuff. All right, so we'll start this party off with an independent book. I'm going to kind of go in alphabetical order, and we'll discuss what I think is the importance of some of these as we go. So, love them or hate them, one of the most important people in comics has been Frank Miller. And 300 was a good example of some of his better later work, or more recent, I should say. And this was, of course, the foundation for the movie. The movie took a lot of images from the graphic novel and adapted them to the screen. So kind of a classic. But not widely considered one of his best works. I would disagree. I think it was a different type of work for him, but it was still very, very good and important work because he has very good composition and framing. And this one is best picked up in the strangely long and not as tall size, because unlike most trade paperbacks, this one was a lot longer and a little shorter than your average book. And of course, you can't have a Spider-Man recommendation without Kraven's Last Hunt. Jim DeMatteis and Mike Zeck, this is probably their best work on Spider-Man and some of the best Spider-Man writing ever. We'll see another cover of this later on because I'm incompetent at filing things. Hi, Becca. How you doing? But this is probably one of the seminal Spider-Man works. It was a lot darker for its time, but it is absolutely one of the most important Spider-Man stories because of the more mature themes that started coming into Spider-Man around this time. They were starting to push the envelope of what you could and couldn't do in comics. And this one really kind of kicked off a lot of the future stories for Spider-Man that could get a little edgier and more grown up. And it actually had people thinking, really disturbing stories could actually be handled maturely in comics, because comics was still regarded as a kid's medium in the 80s when this came out. But it is one of the best Spider-Man stories ever. And you really get to see a lot of really cool stuff in this. Kraven is usually a joke character, but he was handled very well in here. And so was Vermin. So highly recommended to check this trade out. This is one of the best Spider-Man books of all time. Next up, we have Batman Arkham Asylum. Sup, Hazmat? Arkham Asylum is a painted book. Oh, hey, TOS. Hey, Della, Zombie Teddy. How you guys doing? Arkham Asylum is painted, and it has very surreal imagery, kind of disturbing. This is probably Grant Morrison's best work, because Grant Morrison, he's very hit and miss. I know that's unpopular of an opinion, but his writing is really best with a good editor who's going to tell him no. That's best exemplified in the JLA series he did around issue 5. The first story arc with the first 4 issues were great. After that, it became a total minefield of garbage and confusing plot lines that were trying too hard. But this is one of his best works. It's just a weird trip through Arkham Asylum with Batman with some crazy art by Dave McKean. And it stands out because of the strange visual storytelling. The story isn't the greatest, but it is worth reading, and it does show what the medium can do. Next up is another Batman book, Gotham by Gaslight. This was written by Brian Augustin, edited by Mark Waid, and Mike Mignola did the art for it. So if you like Hellboy, this has that same kind of art style, and it really, really does work for this story. They did a follow-up called, I believe it was Master of the Future. but it wasn't as good as this one. This was a far superior book. This is a great Victorian era story with a Batman in the 1800s fighting Jack the Ripper. Like, what if Bruce Wayne was around in the 1880s? So it's a classic. And this one's fairly cheap, too. It was $4. This is the original Prestige. It's not a long story, and it's been reprinted dozens of times. You can usually find a copy with this one combined with the other one for like $20, maybe even less. So keep an eye out for this one if you like Elseworlds books, because it's an interesting take on Batman, especially fighting Jack the Ripper. Of course, you can't have a list of recommended reading without Batman The Dark Knight Returns. Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, Lynn Varley. Classic team up. And this was really the touchstone for a lot of storytelling that we've got now. A lot of people have tried to kind of bring Batman back to this period. This came out in, I believe, 86, because 86 was the year for the change of comics. And it's hard to say too much about this without kind of ruining it. I'm sure most people have already read it or had it ruined for them. And a lot of movies and TV and comics have taken inspiration from this, but we've got an aging Batman putting on the cowl once again to try and sort out things in the city. And it's a very dark tale that really kind of should stand on its own, but so many people have tried to copy it. It's very difficult to appreciate the classic if you've seen all the knockoffs. But this really did set the tone for the 80s, in the late half of the 80s, to become a little darker. Everything should not have been darker, but it did help to have like mature titles come out. So the success of this was a massive step for comics to go. But it's Frank Miller's best work, and it absolutely is worth reading because it has set the tone for a lot of what's happening now. Not the garbage SJW crap, but the good stuff that's come out. Yeah, you're going to see my mouse flying all over the place. All right, next up is Batman the Killing Joke. Also a classic written by Alan Moore with Brian Bollard and John Higgins. Batman has shot Barbara Gordon and taken the commissioner hostage, and Batman has to go get him. It's a short, quick read. They did a movie version of it, which I've heard really mixed things about. But this is one of the best Joker Batman stories, and the art is fantastic. Brian Boland doesn't get enough recognition for how good the art was in this book. It's a really dark story, and there's some disturbing implications that have been drawn from this, that the Joker may have assaulted Barbara in other ways and taken pictures, because he does show pictures to Commissioner Gordon. And there is, of course, the implication at the end that Batman actually did kill Joker, but it's never said in the book. And it's a really interesting story that's definitely worth reading if you like Batman. But it is a darker story, and it's one of the few that kind of tried to copy the Dark Knight Returns style and pulled it off. But it's a much shorter read. It was only about 48 pages, I think. Now, this one's a personal choice. Batman and the Mad Monk. Matt Wagner did a great story here. It's kind of a retelling of an issue of Detective Comics from back in the day when Batman carried guns. And it updates it to the modern mythology of Batman, where Batman doesn't normally carry guns. And the Mad Monk is an interesting villain, but this is a very underrated book, and I think it deserved some love. It's a 4-issue miniseries, and you can find it in trade. It's a lot of fun. Matt Wagner's art style works really well for the story he's telling, and I had a blast reading it. It's one of my favorites, and I think every Batman fan should read it because it's a very underrated book. Next up is, of course, the classic Batman Year One. This is another Frank Miller book with David, last name I can't pronounce. And this is actually 4 issues of Batman starting in 404. And it retells and updates the origin of Batman as a crime fighter, his first year on the job, how he became friends with Commissioner Gordon. And this is post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, so they're kind of rebooting the DC universe slowly, and this was one of the ways they did it. Year 2 is really good too, but this is a much better work. I would absolutely recommend Year 2, but we'll save that one for another stream. But this is absolute reading requirement for Batman fans. A lot of the work in this one made its way into Batman Begins. Yeah, it's David Foran. Sorry. Sorry, Dave, whoever you are. Can't pronounce your last name, so you're a mystery. Man of mystery. Now, if you've got kids, Bone is a great introduction for them for comics. As you can see, Scholastic reprinted these, and I think they're still in print. They were for a long time anyway. So finding copies of these is actually pretty easy, and they were only like 10 or 15 bucks. And it was a fun comic. It's not real serious. It's not overly violent. It's just about these weird little shmoo looking characters and their adventures trying to get home and do various nonsense. There's a dragon, as you can see, and they make little friends on the way and stuff like that. It's a great kids book, very non-threatening, not awash with PC nonsense either. Yeah, most kids love Bone, especially like right around 8 to 10 years old is a pretty good age to like read these with the kids or read them to them because the characters are very simplistically drawn. Jeff Smith really nailed his entire career on this because he never had to write anything else except these books. And they've all been collected in trade. I think there's 10 of them. And it's very, very popular. Next up, Usagi Yojimbo. This is book 1, The Ronin. I'm a huge Usagi fan. I hadn't read him for a long, long time because I thought the anthropomorphic stuff was pretty weird. Still is, but Stan Sakai is brilliant at it. He didn't do the weird sex stuff that a lot of people went for when they did anthropomorphic animals. But I at one point did have the first appearance of Usagi, and I didn't know it, and I sold it for way less than it was worth. But if you can find these reprints, I know Dark Horse re-released a bunch of them about 10 years ago, I think. And I passed them up when I had the chance, but 7 years old, yeah, that's a perfect age. 7, 8 years old, depending on the development of the kid. Bone is a great book. You can always read it to a kid that's like 6, and they'll be fine. That it's not real hard dialogue or anything. Usagi's a little bit of a different story. It's a bit more adult. There's not a lot of blood and gore. He doesn't do that, but you do see people get like limbs hacked off and stuff like that. So kid friendly in my house, but not in normal people's. But Usagi is Usagi just means rabbit in Japanese, so it's Rabbit Yojimbo. So obviously it's based on the story of Yojimbo, a wandering Ronin, and it's a really, really good character with a lot of consistently good storytelling. And this is book 1, so it's a good place to start. IDW series has been great. It's been really, really fun and consistently good. Stan Sakai is one of the best underrated writers of his time because it is so easily accessible by younger readers and older readers. And you don't have to know a lot of like history or anything like that. So if you have a smug friend that wants to nitpick every samurai thing, yeah, you can tell them to go to hell and read this because this is fun. Cold Blood Samurai is one of my personal favorites from the last few years. This was that deserved a lot more love. It's about a Ronin or a samurai rather, who is going to get permission to kill himself because the love of his life died or was murdered, whatever. And he ends up in a conflict that he wants nothing to do with because he just wants to go end his life. It is a very, very tragic story, but it's beautifully told, beautifully illustrated. It's all done with like salamanders and frogs and things like that. So it's anthropomorphic, but it is really, really well told. Yeah, nobody. I'm live again. I'm going to try and do this every Friday. I was going to do it earlier, but I had something come up that required some attention. So had to unfortunately take care of that before I could stream. Otherwise, I'd have been here sooner. All right, next up we have Crisis on Infinite Earths. This was kind of the death of the Silver Age, and it was an excuse for DC to reboot their line and update everything to the 80s and beyond. And really, they've abused the Crisis concept many, many times in the last 20 years. Crisis, however, was the turning point where the Silver Age became the Bronze Age. And they did that by trying to fix their continuity quite a bit and explain how they're merging stuff and rebooting. But it is worth reading because of the historical relevance of that and how much it affected the characters as well as the change in the universe. They got rid of a lot of stuff and brought in some new writers and artists, and some of the best Superman stories come out of the post-Crisis era. But yeah, this was a real tragic story for some of the characters, and it was the death of Barry Allen. And quite frankly, they should have left him stay dead as a hero because he was better off for being dying a hero than what they've done with him after that. So some of the stories now are pretty good, but they should have left Barry dead and left Wally West as the Flash, because there have been more Wally stories, and it affects the way his character does things because he saw Barry sacrifice himself, and so did everybody else. So they should have left him stay as a hero. Daredevil Born Again is one of the better trade paperbacks you could get if you want a good Frank Miller story with that same dude whose name I can't pronounce. Frank Miller did an amazing run on Daredevil, but if you don't want to track down all of the books or all the reprints and you just want to get one Frank Miller Daredevil book, get this one. It's also the basis for season 3 of the Netflix series of Daredevil. It's a fantastic story with great art, and it's probably the highlight of the Daredevil time that Frank Miller worked on it. There are a couple others that we'll look at here in a second, but if you're just going to get one, I would recommend Born Again. The Man Without Fear would be number 2 on my list. This actually is just has Frank Miller writing with John Romita Jr. doing the art. So the art style is very, very different. And this collects a 5-part miniseries that they did in prestige format, which I picked up on eBay recently for like $10 for all 5 issues. It was great. But if you can get it in the nice trade paperbacks, this is the premiere edition that's hardbound. I really like this story. It retells kind of the origin story of Daredevil from the days when he had the yellow uniform and the tragic loss of his father, all that. Yeah, I know, TOS. A lot of people love Barry Allen, but there were just so many more Wally West stories at that point. After the Crisis era, bringing him back, I think, was a mistake because it opens him up to really kind of losing the heroic act of what he did and kind of opening him up to be tarnished by the SJW mobs. Look what they did to Wally West. It was horrific. But this was a great miniseries. Highly recommend checking it out if you like Daredevil or you're just looking to get into comics. A lot of people don't like John Romita Jr.'s art, but I think this is some of his best work. If you can afford to track them down, the Visionaries line where they reprinted most of Frank Miller's work is really, really good way to get all of them and not break the bank. That cover is kind of garbage. This is a later art style that Miller did for this collection, I believe. But look at those hands. You can tell this is later because the proportionality is off. But the interior art is a little more classic Miller. And this is a great way to get all of them because they had thousands of these printed up. But the Visionaries line, I think there were 3 of these, and they collected most of the works in trade paperback. And it was a great way to pick up stuff that would cost you $10, $20 a piece now. So sometimes even more. And there's a great issue where Daredevil gets trapped. He gets trapped in the subway system and has to deal with a bunch of bums trying to beat him up because bums live on... Everybody that lives in New York probably knows this, but there's several tunnels underneath New York City, mostly subway lines and access lines for pipes, stuff like that. And disused subway lines, and the homeless live under there. I talked about this with one of my characters in the first book I did, the Variant Mythos. And there are entire homeless encampments. There's a great book called The Mole People, I think it's called The Mole People. And it talks about how in the 90s, they actually had to send thousands of police officers down there to clear them out because too many people were getting run over by subway cars. And there's some people that live down there full time. They eat rats or whatever they can find, and they never leave the subway system. It's really, really messed up. But the fact that they addressed that in this one issue of Daredevil was pretty cool. The Death of Captain Marvel. Sorry, I couldn't find a better image of this one. This was a seminal work for Marvel because they actually killed the character, and he has stayed dead since. And they've had him appear a few times as like time travel stories, but he's stayed as dead as Uncle Ben. And now he's replaced with Carol Danvers. But this is the original character, Mar-Vell. He was a Kree soldier who came to Earth and ended up staying and becoming the Protector. And he used the Nega bands, which are these bands around his arms that helped amplify his already cool powers. And he ends up fighting Nuke, and his exposure to the character Nuke ends up giving him cancer, and he dies. It's a really, really beautifully written story by Jim Starlin. I think he did the art too. But it's a great story, one of the pivotal moments in Marvel, because this was before things like Dark Knight Returns. Yeah, he got super cancer. But it's a really sad story, but it's really maturely handled, which for the time in the early 80s was actually pretty surprising. And a lot of people were surprised by it. This is actually the first printing of it because it was done as part of the Marvel graphic novel line. This was an early graphic novel. Graphic novels were still very, very new at the time in the 80s. They were basically just prestige format books. And they weren't fully fleshed out to be like mangas are now, where it's like 100 pages. But this was a really, really well done book talking about how all these people deal with it and how Captain Marvel deals with his own demise. It's a great book. And it really leads in, well, if you're a big Avengers fan and you like kind of, if you're a diehard Avengers fan, you'll want to read this and Avengers Forever, where Rick Jones, who's sidekick to like everybody, becomes part of the focal point of the story of Avengers Forever, and it goes through all the different eras of the Avengers. But this is an amazing book. It's one of my all-time favorites if I want to depress myself. Now, another graphic novel from that same line was Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, Triumph and Torment. Roger Stern, Mike Mignola, and Mark Badger did this. Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom team up, and they have a doctor convention to go rescue Doctor Doom's mom's soul from Mephisto. And it is a really interesting book with some crazy art. Mike Mignola did some weird stuff with this, but it was a really, really well-told story. And Roger Stern was one of the greats of the 80s. And this is absolutely worth reading if you like either Doctor Strange or Doctor Doom. And it's got magic, it's got action, all the good stuff. So this is a must-read. Elektra Assassin is another Frank Miller book, but this time I believe somebody else did the art, and it's painted. There's another one that I forgot to put in here, which was Havoc and Wolverine, Meltdown. And that has also got some weird painting. I think Walt Simonson did the art in that one. But because this was a lot more experimental, it's worth checking out the crazy stuff they started doing with art in the 80s. But this is Elektra coming back and being interesting, doing some assassin-y stuff. Very, very worth checking out. Flash Space, Savage Velocity. Space, where did I get that? This was Wally West's premiere after the Crisis event, and him fighting Vandal Savage, who is an immortal. And it collects, I think, the first 6 or 8 issues of the Flash regular series. I loved this storyline. This was a lot of fun. It's got a lot of crazy action, and it's absolutely worth checking out. I was a huge fan of this series from it came out. The first issue is him taking a organ, like a heart, I think, for a transplant and running around with it. But a great series. And if you like The Flash, this is a good one to start with, because Wally's best Flash, sorry. Yeah, painted versus penciled. Yep, absolutely. It was painted with like this watercolor look. I'm sure you can find some art online. I didn't download any samples of art because it would bog me down too much on this. Oh, hey, Dangerous. I'm just talking about comics I think everybody should read, because I'm a giant nerd and I thought I'd tell everyone. So this is definitely worth checking out, and it really shows his insecurity as him becoming the Flash without Barry around to guide him effectively. Flying Sparks I included because this is a recent book by John Delarose. I know he's very controversial, but this was actually surprisingly well done. I'd recommend getting the first 2 volumes of this because they were really, really interesting, with a new hero unsure of herself, trying to find her place, and her boyfriend ends up being associated with the mob, and she doesn't know. So, interesting take on the superhero genre, with new characters and new experiences, with some crazy abilities. She doesn't seem to have actual powers per se. It's all gadgets and gear that kind of simulate powers. Yeah, pretty much. I am a nerd. I accept that. I'm a nerd with less skill set because I don't know anything about computers. But if you get a chance you want to check out something more modern, these books are actually worth checking out. I thought they were pretty well done. The artist just got hired over at Marvel. He's pretty talented, and he's got a lot of potential. And the characters were interesting. So if you're looking for something more recent, these are like 15, 18 bucks online for the paperbacks. I think the trade you could get digitally, I think, is like $6 or $8. But it's worth checking out. I had a lot of fun reading these, and it was some of the better new stuff out there. So if you're looking for something a little more recent that's actually worth checking out, I would recommend these. Now, From Hell's another Alan Moore book with Eddie Campbell, and this is about Jack the Ripper. There was a movie with Johnny Depp that was pretty mediocre that came out. I own it, so I can say that. That was based on this, but the actual comic book was a lot more interesting and had a lot more details that actually comes from the Ripper case files and the letters and all that. So they actually did some research, and then they kind of extrapolate who they think the killer was at the end. It's a really, really good read, and it's not a superhero book, so I tried to include some that weren't superhero books. But it's absolutely worth checking out. It's one of Alan Moore's later good works that wasn't completely batshit insane. Yeah, it was totally mediocre, man. Heather Graham looked really hot, and there were no. If you look at the pictures of prostitutes from the 1880s, they didn't look like Heather Graham at all. They looked like roughed up trailer park queens. Does that mean out loud? I don't even know. So if you get a chance and you want to read like a horror story, this one was really, really good and absolutely worth checking out. Much better than the movie. The art is not going to be for everyone, though. It does have kind of this chalky sketch type of art, but it is worth a read. Hellboy, Seeds of Destruction. This is the first Hellboy book written by Mike Mignola. He did the art too, with some work by John Byrne. Absolutely worth reading. The art is very, very abstract and surreal. Oh, hey, monkey. But the story itself is actually pretty solid. It's got a lot of Lovecraftian elements. Mike is clearly a fan of Lovecraft's work, and it shows, especially in this first volume. It's got Rasputin in it. So, and if you don't know who Rasputin is, he was the mystic who claimed he could treat the Tsar's son of his hemophilia, and he allegedly could help him with that. He was able to supposedly cure the boy a couple times, and he supposedly had all these mystic powers, and it took a lot of work to kill him. They tried poisoning him, shooting him, and they finally had to ice pick him and toss him in the river. But yeah, the story of that guy is pretty interesting too. So if you get a chance and you want to read something that combines a little bit of superhero type stuff with Lovecraftian horror and demons, yeah, this one is going to be up your alley. and the art style is really dark with bright reds, and it really works quite well. Mignola is really good with shadows. And then we have Hulk, Future Imperfect. Peter David, George Perez, Dale Keown. The Hulk goes to the future and finds out that an evil version of himself in the future rules the world. Pretty good stuff. I guess that's a win, maybe? I don't know. Next up is the Infinity Gauntlet. If you saw the movie, you have kind of an idea what you could get here, but it's got a lot more superhero stuff. And the superheroes get boned way harder in this than they do in the movie. And they use a lot more characters, too. Adam Warlock plays a major part in this, and he wasn't even in the movies. Same with the Silver Surfer and a couple of the others. So worth checking out and seeing how the characters figure out how to stop Thanos, and after most of them get boned in the process. And Thanos is actually in love with Death, who is a character in the Marvel Universe. He's in love with her and wants to impress her by wiping everyone out. It wasn't some eco nonsense. Yeah, the movie was based on this. Judge Dredd America. This is in my opinion, the best Judge Dredd story, other than maybe the issue where he becomes a werewolf. But in this one, Judge Dredd is actually the villain, and you see it through another perspective. This is a really interesting book. It's a little lefty on the politics, but it's an interesting read, and it's one of the best Judge Dredd stories to find. Yeah, at the end of one of the movies, Dangerous, Adam Warlock was in the cocoon. It was Guardians of the Galaxy 2, I think. The post-credit scene, the person in the cocoon is Adam Warlock, because he's one of those gold species people. There's the other cover of Kraven's Last Hunt that I already talked about. I like this cover because he looks like he's taking an angry poop. Great Spider-Man story, though. Absolutely. Then this is a little bit different pace. This is Mouse. This is where mice are Jews and cats are Germans from the 40s. This is a really depressing story, but it's really well written, and it is used in classrooms now when they do teaching on World War II, because this provides a first-person account of somebody that went through the camps and what everybody went through. People hiding and trying not to go in there. It's real depressing. Volume 1 is usually taught in college and some high schools. Volume 2 is not always taught, but it's absolutely worth reading the first book for sure. If you're looking for something that's really depressing and going to make you cry, you could read this one. Yeah, I know, dangerous, but it's still a selling point because the guy's actually pretty good. Napalm Brothers, this is one I really liked recently. I'm putting this in here because it has more of the indie style from the 70s that you don't see anymore. No, Danger, surprisingly, it's not that movie that the Day the Clown Cried. Let's get into work, but this will always be and also ran as the Flash. He's better than Impulse, though. We think we could agree on that. But this is they just released issue 2 of this, and it's in perfect bound format. It's worth reading. It's about some former Vietnam vets that end up getting involved in a gang war, and there's a giant monkey in a van, and the art is very psychedelic. I did a review on this, and I have to say this was a very memorable book because every page looked like it could be shown in black light as a poster. The art is very 70s indie art, very weird, but it's worth reading because the story is actually pretty good, and it has a different look than most comics. And if you're an artist especially, I think you should check this out. It's still available on Amazon for like $8 or $9. And issue 2 should be up there too, but this is definitely worth checking out. Sandman Mystery Theater, the Tarantula. This collects, I think, the first four issues of Sandman Mystery Theater. And it takes a character from the 40s, which is the Sandman, Wesley Dodds, and kind of reimagines him as a bored rich guy who decides to go do some private detective work. He's sort of a 1940s Batman, but he's got a smoke gun. That's why he wears the gas mask. And he's doing all sorts of detective stuff. This series was great. It only lasted, I think, 60 issues, 60 or 80. But most of them were reprinted. Hey, Hyman. And this one was really, really good because it's kind of reintroducing the character who has been largely ignored and brings him into the DCU, but he's fighting with the other mystery men, and they're all like normal people. Their superpowers are very, very low powered if they have any. So he doesn't really have any, except they did carry over some of the Neil Gaiman stuff where he has weird dreams. So it's an interesting story. It's much more detective based, more crime noir. And it's really good. I highly, highly recommend tracking these down. These are absolutely worth checking out. Speaking of the Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes, I think a lot of these are a little overrated, to be honest. They didn't age very well, but for the time, they were very, very edgy. And a lot of things were done in here that you didn't do before. It was one of the first real Vertigo titles to take off. And people love it. So if you're getting into comics and you want to kind of see what different styles are out there, the Sandman is definitely going to be one you'll want to check out. Sam Keith's illustrations give it kind of a surrealist look. And Neil Gaiman's writing is very, very popular, especially from this time. This was probably when he was at his peak. But for me, it just isn't as good as everybody says, but it is worth reading. At least the first volume. There's some really good stuff in random issues that I like, but it's just not my thing. But if you're getting into comics, this is definitely one you might want to check out because a lot of people don't like what I like. No, they used to no Dangerous, not the movie. They used to call superheroes mystery men because the term superhero was actually trademarked by DC and Marvel jointly. So for a long time, you couldn't use the word superhero in print without getting sued. So you had to call them mystery men. And it worked better because not everybody at the time period was a superhero. There were a lot of people that were just like vigilantes, like the Crimson Avenger, who just ran around as a guy with a mask on. They didn't have any real powers other than fisticuffs. Silver Surfer Parable is one of Stan Lee's best last works, if that makes sense. This was written much longer after he had really retired from writing comics, and he teamed up with Moebius, so it's got a real weird look to it. Moebius is a European artist, and he does a lot of this hatch work, which normally I find a little weird. It's not for me, but it's really well done. It's just not my thing. But this book was really, really good. And it's probably the best Galactus and Silver Surfer story out there. So this was better than anything that Stan Lee did when he first created Silver Surfer and Galactus. And it's absolutely worth a read. This is, if you're a comic collector, you should have this on your shelf. It's a fantastic book. And you can't have a list like this without Sin City. As far as Frank Miller's later work, this is sort of in the middle of his career. And it's all black and white except for like yellow and red occasionally, I think. But it's lots of good use of negative space. Like instead of drawing a white background with drops, he actually just left the white lines. It's really, really weird and beautiful at the same time as far as the art goes. A lot of people don't like it. I think these are very underrated, and you should at least read one of them. Most of them are really good. I would get the first book and just start there. Yeah, Mystery Men, I think, was a Dark Horse title, Dangerous. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I know it was a series. Just like Men in Black, the movie was based off of an Aerosil comic book. Very, very loosely. Man of Steel, This is a collection of the John Byrne miniseries that came right after Crisis on Infinite Earths. And it see, do I have the other picture? Yeah, this was one of the covers. This cover's actually better. Him and Marv Wolfman, Jerry Ordway, and Dick Giordano, something like that. They relaunched Superman's titles. They changed Superman to Adventures of Superman and relaunched the Superman series with John Byrne at the helm. And this is probably the best telling of Superman's origin out there. And it absolutely is a must-read for every Superman fan. And John Byrne is one of the best Superman artists, along with Roger Stern and Jerry Ordway. But this is absolutely worth checking out. It's much better than any of the Bendis crap that's going on now. When Bendis started, they actually redid the miniseries and called it Man of Steel, and it's a slap in the face to John Byrne's run, which was far superior. And John Byrne drew Batman and Superman way better. The Crow is a forgotten one that a lot of people tend to overlook when they're doing lists like this. James O'Barr wrote this after his girlfriend was brutally assaulted, and he felt powerless, so he created the Crow and kind of retold the story in a therapeutic way for himself to be a vigilante who gets revenge on the people that did a crime against him and his girlfriend. This is a must-read for comic fans because it's one of the best indie books that people don't remember. Same thing as the comic book. Yeah, the Crow movie was actually a little watered down. Forget about it, and I think that's a big travesty. This should not be forgotten. This is a classic of comic telling. Now, this is not a comprehensive list, of course. There are a lot of other books that I would recommend, and I'll probably do themed ones like Batman, Superman, etc. But this is just some of the ones I wanted to go over. The Punisher, Welcome Back, Frank, is Garth Ennis, Matt Dillon, and Jimmy Palmiotti with covers by Tim Bradstreet. These covers were great. And it's kind of a semi-serious take on the Punisher, where he fights some really weird and goofy villains. If you saw the movie with Thomas Jane, it's pretty similar to that, but a little crazier and with more elaborate contraptions. And absolutely worth reading. It's a lot of fun and brutal at the same time, so you'll get Garth Ennis' sense of humor from his prime when it was dark and brutal and bloody, and Castle just cuts his way through the mob and does so many horrific things to this mob family. It's really fun. And if you like the movie, you'll like this, I think. The art isn't going to be for everyone, but Dylan was a really, really talented artist, and unfortunately, he passed away a few years back. But he did inspire a lot of other people along the way. Next, Thor Visionaries, Walt Simonson. Walt Simonson did the best Thor run ever. And his work on Thor is absolutely worth reading and a must-read for Avengers fans, even Thor fans. If you're a Thor fan, you can't really call yourself a Thor fan if you haven't read this. And the Ragnarok storyline they did was amazing. It was fantastic. Great characterization that's been butchered later on by everybody that followed Walt Simonson on this. So the art is Walt Simonson's particular style. It's not going to be for everyone, but I highly recommend this book. This was fantastic. I like the original Thomas Jane one better than the Dolph Lundgren movie, Dangerous. I do think that it doesn't get a fair shake because on further viewings, it does hold up pretty well. But the Dolph Lundgren, I think, looked more like the Punisher than any of the three guys that played him. Although the Warzone actor, I forget his name off the top of my head, he really nailed the Garth Ennis version of the Punisher as far as the look goes. But I did like the Thomas Jane one. He just didn't really look the part. All right, another classic, V for Vendetta. This one probably holds some relevance for our current times, more than some people would like to admit. But it's a dystopian book about authoritarian rule after a deadly contagion swept through the UK and the people that fight back. It's a great book. The art is not the greatest. Sorry, David Lloyd, but the art could have been better. But the story is really good. It's really interesting, and it's got a lot of historical factoids. You do learn about Guy Fawkes, and it did popularize the mask, unfortunately, for all of us who think those people are annoying. Yeah, Ray Stevenson. I like that actor, and he looked the part for Garth Ennis's run. But V for Vendetta is one of Alan Moore's better works, and it's, I think, a classic. And a lot of people would agree with me. Some people don't. Some people are kind of hung up on the art style. But it's worth a read. It was another 80s classic that holds up pretty well today. And Alan Moore may have intended it to be a reflection of Margaret Thatcher's Britain, but it holds up pretty well with different time periods and different leadership. If you like those characters dangerous, you should read Welcome Back, Frank. They have a little more love. Speaking of Alan Moore, The Watchmen. Now, the movie didn't do the book justice. This was another alternate world take on superheroes as they try and unify the world through a grand plan, and a couple of them don't particularly go along with it. But it was really worth the read, but I think it's been watered down a little bit over time. And it's definitely a product of the 80s, but it's absolutely worth the read. It's got a lot of interesting storytelling that's been copied several times very poorly. So you want to go to the source material and read the originals. So absolutely worth checking out, but read the original and don't just watch the movie. The movie doesn't do the book anywhere near justice. Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. This is actually a very depressing book. It's another Alan Moore, but it's the end of the Silver Age Superman. The last two issues of Action Comics and I think it was Superman were given to Alan Moore to kind of wrap up Silver Age Superman, and he did it in a really dark way. Hey, Johnny. And it's a really interesting story about how Superman completes his affairs, shall we say. So it's an interesting Elseworlds book. They've kind of put it in an alternate timeline thing, but it's definitely worth the read. And Superman does some things in here that you wouldn't expect. So highly recommended alternate take on Superman if you're really into endings for things. Now, this is another indie book. This was put out by Oni Press. It's called Whiteout. They did a movie, I think it was with Kate Beckinsale. Greg Rucka wrote this, and it's about this marshal that has to go down and solve a murder in Antarctica. And she has to deal with a killer being on the loose and the weather because there's whiteout conditions, there's a blizzard, there's no help, no backup. She's the only person there that's got a gun, in theory, and she has to solve this murder. And it's a really kind of strange art style. It has kind of that Walt Simonson, John Romita Jr. look to it where everything's a little off proportion, but it is a fantastic detective story set in an unusual place with a psycho trying to kill her for trying to uncover who he is. Definitely worth tracking down. Very underrated book that a lot of people would have never read or even heard of. And the movie didn't do it justice either. And this lady goes through quite a bit to survive, let alone catch the bad guy. There was a sequel that wasn't as good, but it was also good. It just wasn't worth making this list. The Wolverine 4-issue miniseries from Chris Claremont and Frank Miller. This is probably the best Wolverine story. It's the 4-issue miniseries collected in one volume. And it's been reprinted dozens of times. And it's absolutely worth tracking down. He fights ninjas. I don't know if I need to say more than that. But it adds a lot of depth to the character of Wolverine that's still being used today. About his time in Japan, things like that. And it was expanded on later in the regular Wolverine series that came, I think, the next year, where he went on Sword Quest, which was set in Mandapore and led all over the place and hanging out with Spider-Woman, stuff like that. But this was the seminal Wolverine book of its time, and it's still one of the best Wolverine stories. and he's not a whiny little bitch like he is now. As far as the X-Men goes, X-Men God Loves Man Kills is probably one of the best X-Men stories out there. Easily my favorite, I think. Chris Claremont and Brett Eric Anderson did this beautiful story about acceptance and tolerance and how much people feared the mutants at the time when Claremont was writing the book. This was kind of a one-off. It's a short read, but it is really beautifully done, talking about accepting people that are different than you. And it's, I would say, aimed at teenagers, but this is, when I took a fantasy literature class in college, they taught this book. And it's really, really well done. It holds up really well. The allegory is very well handled, very mature. But it's aimed at an audience that probably would be a little more interested in it, because adults in your 30s and 40s, you already have these kind of moral lessons taught to you. But this handles that subject very maturely, unlike the heavy-handed nonsense politics of today. And this is absolutely one that should be on the shelf of every single comic fan. Speaking of the X-Men, though, Days of Future Past. This was one of the more, unlike the other one, which was a lot more serious and kind of grounded. This one is a time travel story about when mutants are being hunted by the Sentinels, and they have to do some time travel to save the day. The movie did not cover this worth a damn at all. But this is one of the best stories of the X-Men. I don't think I included... No, this is the last one. Dark Phoenix Saga gets a lot of love, and it should. It was a really well-done book. But this is a much better storyline for people that aren't as familiar with the characters. Like, they may know who they are, but you had to know a little bit more lore to get the most out of the Dark Phoenix Saga. And this one is a much better thing for people who kind of know who the characters are. They've seen them in other media, and they could get more out of this as far as storytelling goes. So I would pick this one over Dark Phoenix Saga if you're going to gift someone who's not very familiar with the X-Men and saw the animated series or something like that. You'll get more out of this than you will out of Dark Phoenix Saga in that case. So if you're just getting into comics, or you know someone that is a casual that wants to read some comics, this would be a much better one. Although I would still say give them God Loves Man Kills, because it's the best X-Men story. But that's really kind of the list I put together today. I'll probably do some themed ones with like books people should own for X-Men and Batman and stuff like that. But this is just sort of a broad base stroke like that. So I thought it would be fun to do this for today's show, because there wasn't a lot of news going on. And we already went over the new comics for next week. So I thought I'd go over some recommendations. But absolutely, X-Men God Loves Man Kills should be on everyone's shelf if you're a big comic fan. And this is just a beautiful piece from the 80s that doesn't get enough love, like so many on the list. But I highly recommend checking some of these out. At least give them a shot. I think most of these are available on Kindle and Comixology if you've got those and you don't want to pay a lot of money. But a lot of them have been reprinted several times, so you can find used copies or whatever. And like I said, some of them are absolutely worth tracking down. But I'm going to probably end the stream there. And then links are in the description if you want to support the channel or check out my other stuff. But here's the cover of book 3, by the way. So that's all I had today. I just wanted to do a quick stream. But you got any questions? Right on, Jack. I've been thinking about going down the X-Men road. Made my choice. Oh, no problem, man. Hope you enjoy them. There's some great books out there. I would definitely get some older stuff. Some of the new stuff is just hot garbage. Oh, hey, Star. How you doing? So yeah, the X-Men are a great choice. But there's a lot out there that's worth checking out, and find something that you like. Flip through some books. But those are the ones I'd recommend that everybody should at least read. And some of them I think you'll end up putting on your shelf. But thank you all for coming out, and we'll hopefully see you on Monkey in the Morning or on the next Friday night comic stream. Until then, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.